After my video where I compared the Nintendo 64 and PS1 racing games twice, I decided to take a look at a different genre, FPS games. I've seen people claim the Nintendo 64 had the better FPS games, while others claimed the PS1 just mopped the floor with them. Well, there were less of these games on both systems, so today I'll be taking one game from each franchise so that we don't need to compare 4 Turok games against 4 random PS1 games. And we're not just comparing the graphics this time, we're comparing far more. In the case of direct ports, we'll compare port differences to decide which port is better. Otherwise, we'll compare games that may be a little, or sometimes very different, to see which one is the overall better and more enjoyable experience. Sometimes the better option won't be clear. Also, if you think I'm not being objective, please think about what an objective review of art actually entails. Anyways, let's begin. Duke Nukem Total Meltdown and 64 are both 1997 releases of Duke Nukem for the PS1 and Nintendo 64. Both of these versions are great, first of all, though both have their fair share of differences. There's quite a few pieces of censorship in the Nintendo 64 version, though not really that much to bother anyone as it's hidden quite well. Graphically, the PS1 version of Duke is sharp and a little crunchy, though in my opinion that's better than the Nintendo 64's blurry visuals. The PS1 version of Duke also contains 6 levels in a new episode that is exclusive and not available on the PC or Nintendo 64 version, along with CD quality music and better audio in general, though on the other hand the Nintendo 64 version has some more decorations on the exterior of buildings. Overall, I just have to give a point to the PS1 version as it has more content, sharper visuals, and better sound. While this may be stretching the definition of an FPS a little bit, Jumping Flash 2 is a 1996 FPS 3D platformer, while Turok is just a box standard FPS from 1997. Jumping Flash 2 has sharp visuals, very large levels, and actually good controls. Seriously. It is the most light-hearted game in this video, and it just oozes charm. The music is really nice and cheerful too. Turok is Turok. Someone forgot to turn off their primordial fog machine because you can't see more than like a foot in front of you. Not ideal. While the environments try to be realistic, the repeating textures of actually decent resolution are placed in levels that are just a little bit too homogeneous to navigate easily, especially with the tiny render distance. So, alongside some questionable controls, it was Iguana's first attempt and Exact's third, so it makes sense that Jumping Flash 2 would be more refined. That's why it gets a point. Forsaken and Forsaken 64 are two 6 Degrees of Freedom shooters. Forsaken released in 1996, and Forsaken 64 in 1998. For being the same game, they have quite a few differences. The N64 version is slightly dimmer and has way worse texture quality, while the PS1 version runs at 60 FPS while looking like that. Great effects in both games, and some actually decent controls in both as well, but with better textures, sound, and performance, the PS1 version gets a point. I could have compared Doom to Doom 64, but as Doom 64 is a completely different game made well after Doom, I picked Powerslave, as both of these games came out in 1997. Both games also featured their fair share of maze levels with some pretty nice looking environments in both, at least for their engines. I love Doom 64 personally. I have the PC port as well, and it is so much better than the N64 one. But on the N64 and PS1, Powerslave simply has the better textures, more advanced level geometry, and sloping terrain, something that Doom 64 lacks, as well as more animations and even a proper story, with voice acting. I love Doom 64, but I just have to give Powerslave a point.
Welcome, mortal. I am King Ramses. When my body was laid to rest here.
MDK came out in 1997, while Armorines Project Swarm came out in 1999. These games are very different, which is partially what makes them interesting to compare. I know MDK is technically not in first person, but considering how the camera works, it may as well be. You have this cool-ass scope in MDK, which gives you up to 100 times zoom, and the combat can feel like a mixture of puzzles and run-gun action. Strafing is highly recommended. Armorines Project Swarm has you run across foggy environments with a slow-firing gun. The game has a 480i and 240p mode, neither of which seem to actually help the game's performance. Either way, the mission-based structure of Armorines is a great base for a great game. It's just that it's not fun, it's not enjoyable, though I'm not giving either game a point, as I think that they're both just a little bit too different to rank, and Armorines Project Swarm is famously shit. As my camera control in Quake 2 implies, this game utilizes the PS1 mouse peripheral for very precise aiming, something that can't be said about Quake 2. Both came out in 1999, and wow, how they managed to cram Quake 2 onto the PlayStation is both a testament to the platform's raw power, but also its versatility. Both games featured a similar amount of levels, though the PS1 version features an extra single-player one and 2 more multiplayer ones. The lighting in the Nintendo 64 version is moodier, but the textures are just far worse. The controls are automatically worse because of the mouse control on the PS1 version, and the cool-ass music is just gone. One aspect the PS1 version has to deal with are loading times due to the small 2MB of main RAM the PS1 had, so the levels are cut up into smaller sections. Timing it, loading an entirely new level actually takes the same amount of time on both systems, though in every mid-level load, the PS1 loses around 2 to 4 seconds. You know, it is what it is. The loading delays don't stop the PS1 version from being the far superior option, as it just looks, sounds, and just feels better to play. You can also play 4-player deathmatch with mouse controls if you have 2 multi-taps. It's incredible. I'm awful at tactic games, so when I saw Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six from 1999, well, both of these releases take completely different approaches to Rainbow Six. The N64 version is based off of the PC release, while the PS1 took a different approach. Both let you control your AI companions, and both games seem to look roughly the same, though the N64 version can sometimes be fucking hideous. The N64 also has a map that shows you where the enemies are, and one of you guys just follows you around. It's kind of too close to call, as both of the games are too similar and too different, and honestly, we're just not gonna give it any points. 007 The World Is Not Enough has 2 completely different games with the same name on both systems. Both of these games are very different. Both came out in 2000, and to get that out of the way, yes, the PS1 has better textures, audio, and it has FMVs from the movie, though the N64 one follows the movie within its gameplay much more closely. Both versions are worth a play as they're quite different, though the N64 version is far more cinematic, and it kind of feels like a sequel to Goldeneye. That's why it gets a point. Medal of Honor is a 1999 World War II FPS game that was made because of a stroke of inspiration Steven Spielberg had watching his son play Goldeneye 007, a game which released in 1997. How do they stack up? Well, graphically, Rare did a great job using the N64's muddy graphics to create realistic-looking scenery. While Medal of Honor doesn't look pretty, it's very realistic and gritty. Both games have a mission-based objective structure, but it's far easier and more comfortable to use the dual analog aiming on Medal of Honor. The sound and textures are also far higher in resolution, and the game itself was far more realistic at a time when realistic World War II shooters weren't common at all. As much of a trendsetter as Goldeneye was for mission-based FPS games, Medal of Honor was the same for World War II shooters, and it spawned games like Call of Duty. Considering how Goldeneye came out earlier, we've reached a situation that's honestly too close to call. This one, however, our final two, won't be too close to call. I'm gonna set this one up a little bit differently. Both of these games released in the year 2000. Perfect Dark, you know it. You possibly even love it. Perfect Dark, yeah. A very cinematic Nintendo 64 FPS that really tries to maximize the power of the N64 to deliver a fun game. Does it succeed? Well, yeah. Thanks to some generous auto-aim, the controls are fine even with the tank control-esque setup. Graphically, the environments don't look that bad, but honestly, they're very flat. Other than that, it's GoldenEye 2, basically. Now let's compare it to a different movie tie-in game, one that entered development hell and exited out the other end as something truly special.
Containment field at maximum.
So you remember when I called Perfect Dark cinematic? Alien Resurrection takes the cake. This game has mouse controls as well, which is great by the way. The guys behind Croc decided to show off what the PS1 could truly do. The dark corridors make the distance fog a non-issue. If anything, they honestly make the game a bit more terrifying. The game also has puzzle elements as it is a survival horror game, but holy shit, it does everything right. The camera work and sound design make this game actually scare you. I'd argue more than any other 5th gen game. The gunplay can be pretty frantic, and sometimes you can get jumped, but the game isn't without its downsides. The biggest one is that the game can just be sadistic sometimes, especially if you don't have a mouse. Even so, the highly detailed environments and literally everything else is why this game deserves a point. It's 6 versus 1. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to avoid reviewing like sequels and stuff, so I wanted to pick the first game in the franchise, except for Jumping Flash 2 because the release dates would be closer. But yeah, it's kind of a clean sweep. Or is it? Yeah, so excluding Armorines Project Swarm, every other game here is still quite good. Granted, you might want to play, I'd argue most of them on PC, but hey, they're still really good games. But if we'd just go back to the PS1 and Nintendo 64, I'd have to argue that the PS1 just takes the crown in this particular genre. See you next time.